Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Institute's Global Status of Carbon Capture and Storage 2024 report, Collaborating for a Net Zero Future. My name is Jessica Oglesby, and I'm the Head of Events and Communications at the Global CCS Institute. As a brief introduction, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Institute or this publication, we are a global NGO dedicated to accelerating the deployment of carbon capture and storage, a vital technology to tackle climate change and to deliver climate neutrality. Since 2015, the Institute has been producing this comprehensive annual status report, which looks at the past 12 months of CCS progress globally. Providing an overview of the 2024 Global Status Report today will be the Institute's CEO, Jared Daniels, and then we'll have the opportunity to hear pre-recorded remarks from His Excellency Rafizi Ramli, Malaysia's Minister of the Economy. Three things to note before we begin. One, this session is being recorded, and we'll share the recordings on our website in the coming days. If you'd like to review any part of today's conversation or share it with your colleagues, you'll have that opportunity. Two, the report is now live on the Institute's website and can be found at globalccsinstitute.com/global-status-report. You can also scan the QR code that's on the screen. Three, please feel free to share your live tweets and comments with us on your social accounts, leveraging the hashtag #GlobalStatus2024, and we'll be sure to amplify that on our channels. Our handle on X is @GlobalCCS, and on LinkedIn, it's Global CCS Institute. With that, I'll now hand it over to the Institute CEO, Jared Daniels, to highlight CCS milestones and the key findings of the report. Jared, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jess, and thank you all for being here. We're extremely excited to provide an overview of the global status of CCS report and highlight the key CCS milestones that we've been tracking over this past year. This year's report, Collaborating for a Net Zero Future, emphasizes the power of global collaboration as governments and industry around the world work together toward the shared common goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reaching net zero as quickly as possible. Achieving the objective of the Paris Agreement to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees requires net zero greenhouse gases by 2050, which is only 25 years away. The value of CCS is globally recognized, and collaboration is now essential to drive industry growth and commercial deployment. There are now a number of collaborative platforms around the world, including the Clean Energy Ministerial, Mission Innovation, the new Carbon Management Challenge, the Asia CCS Network, which are providing incredibly useful, driving ambition and sharing knowledge. The Industrial Carbon Management Strategy adopted by the European Commission in early 2024 is also an outstanding example of government collaboration to accelerate the deployment of CCS through initiatives across policy, infrastructure, regulation, carbon accounting, and research. Beyond that, a number of bilateral agreements, which are particularly important for the development of cross-border value chains, are being put in place, highlighting an acceleration in intergovernmental collaboration. The Institute has identified over 50 bilateral agreements, or MOUs, executed by national governments since 2020 that include CCS within their scope. There are also many strong examples of public-private partnerships to develop CCS facilities emerging in all jurisdictions. For example, in Saudi Arabia, the Energy Ministry has signed a joint development agreement with Saudi Aramco, SLB, and Linde to establish a CCUS hub in Jubail with a capacity to store up to 9 million ton per annum of CO2 yet this decade. In Asia, the Shepherd CCS project is a standout, with the Malaysian and South Korean governments working with a range of companies to establish a cross-border CCS project. Finally, private sector cooperation continues to leverage the diversity of competencies across the value chain. Technology companies are partnering with project developers, shipping companies are working with ports to study the integration of liquid CO2 carriers into port facilities, and industrial emitters are working with transport and storage developers to abate their emissions. Despite a relatively challenging year for low carbon investments around the world, 2024 has seen significant growth in the CCS facilities pipeline. As of July 2024, there were 628 projects in the pipeline that the Institute is tracking across all stages of development and operation, representing a 60% year-on-year increase. The entire project pipeline now has a cumulative capture capacity of over 416 million ton per annum, which is a 32% compound annual growth rate over the last 7 years. And looking at the chart in this slide, capture capacity for projects in advanced development and construction is increasing each year. Breaking down the projects in the pipeline, there are currently 50 commercial CCS facilities in operation. 44 projects are now in construction. 247 projects are in advanced development, more than double the number since last year's report. These are projects which are completing or have completed a front-end engineering design or FEED study. For storage sites, the proponent is completing a submission or submitted a field development plan or equivalent to regulators. This progress signifies a notable step towards construction entailing substantial engineering funding and commitment levels. 287 projects are in early development stages, and these are projects which are completing or have completed a pre-feasibility or feasibility study. Diving deeper into the project pipeline, this chart shows growth and diversity of CCS projects across various industries, as well as across expected operational dates. This chart usefully highlights that CCS is highly versatile. One of its strengths is the diversity of CCS applications, which continues to expand for projects in all stages of development. Policy does indeed drive growth, indicative in the number of ethanol projects emerging, many based here in the United States, where I come to you today. There are now 222 transport and storage projects, which currently do not include associated capture facility. This is more than doubled year on year, underscoring the predominance of the network model and the anticipated market for these services. It also underscores the collaboration we're seeing drive new CCS developments globally. Hard to abate sector projects are on the rise, and direct air capture projects are increasing. It's useful to contrast this to just a couple of years ago to understand the shift in the general understanding and investment appetite for long-term industrial carbon management. As I said just a minute ago, policy does indeed drive growth. This year's report highlights that we are seeing strong support for CCS through international and multilateral policy initiatives. CCS has been included in the global stocktake as a key technology for reducing emissions in hard-to-abate sectors. Some of the upcoming NDC 3.0, due in February of next year, February 2025, are expected to include CCS investment plans. And, as already mentioned today, the Carbon Management Challenge. We've also seen governments around the world seek to strengthen their CCS legal and regulatory regimes or take steps toward designing or releasing CCS-specific legislation. For first movers with existing regimes, the focus has been on expansion, refinement, completion, and implementation. For example, the US is reviewing permits for over 100 wells under the Class 6 program of the UIC program here through our US EPA. In Europe and the UK, regulators are building on the early legal and regulatory frameworks and refining permitting processes to align with project experience and allow the implementation of transboundary CCS value chains. In Australia, the government introduced legislation to implement the country's London Protocol commitments and support the import and export of CO2 within a new permit regime. In jurisdictions spanning the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and South America, regulators are developing CCS legislation and the regulations to support deployment. And in the APAC region, where the focus is on enabling transboundary CCS value chains, legal and regulatory frameworks are being developed to facilitate hub development and to enable CO2 import and export. As we've discussed already, substantial momentum for CCS around the world has been built on the back of good policymaking. In the current financial climate, project de-risking in the form of long-term direct or indirect public support remains key to accelerated CCS infrastructure development and deployment. Where policy has improved financing prospects, we're seeing that partially offset over the past 12 months by cost inflation, rising interest rates, permitting challenges, and political uncertainty. This means that the spike in projects might be showing signs of slowing down. Notable examples are some of the delays and cancellations we've seen of CO2 pipeline and hydrogen projects here in the United States. Projects in the US, the EU, Canada, and the Middle East demonstrate that without a mandate or firm global carbon price, CCS projects must rely on public sector support through a variety of mechanisms, tax credits, loans, other forms of investment. But despite the challenges that are out there, there's several potential tailwinds for CCS financing as well. The growing need for reliable baseload power and demand for high quality carbon credits could present as a tailwind and be supportive of CCS moving forward. The demand for high quality removal credits. This initially started with DACs or direct air capture carbon storage projects and has since evolved to include BECCS projects as well, the bioenergy plus CCX projects. Increasing multilateral development bank support for CCS could fund critical activities like legislation development, CO2 storage assessments, and feasibility studies in developing economies. These are critical path issues for accelerating deployment in those regions. MDB support for CCS is currently relatively limited, but there's potential to drive support through the Carbon Management Challenge and inclusion in national climate goals and country NDCs. The momentum and equity investments and mergers and acquisitions we've seen recently indicate diverse financing interest in CCS, including pension plans, infrastructure funds, venture arms of oil and gas companies, and private equity. Interest from such a diverse set of investors indicates the potential of CCS as a commercially viable decarbonization technology. This may have positive implications for debt financing, which is not yet available for CCS projects. Hopefully that will change soon. I'll now pivot over to highlight some of the regional CCS milestones we've seen at the Institute over the past year. The Americas continues to lead the world in CCS facility deployment with 27 projects in operation, 18 commencing construction across the US, Brazil, and Canada. Looking at the United States, the US continues to lead the global CCS facility count with 19 operating projects. CCS deployment in the US continues to be catalyzed by strong policy support. Some highlights include the bipartisan infrastructure law, which includes more than $12 billion US of investment to support carbon management and clean hydrogen hubs, of which approximately $10 billion US has already been awarded or is in negotiations. The Inflation Reduction Act increased the dollar value of tax credits for geologic storage of CO2, lowering the carbon capture thresholds to qualify for tax credits, and added provisions for direct pay and tax credit transferability. These all made this policy tool more efficient for commercial developers. The credit level is now $85 per ton of CO2 captured and stored in dedicated reservoirs and $180 per ton of CO2 removed through DACs. The US is also requiring coal and new gas-fired power plants to capture 90% of their CO2 emissions by 2032, another policy driver. The queue of Class 6 injection well permit applications is robust and growing. The EPA released a publicly available permit tracker dashboard that shows there are 49 projects with 148 applications under review across 15 states and one tribal nation. And in addition to that, at the federal level, an additional 39 projects with 83 well applications are under review in states with what they call Class 6 primacy, where those can be adjudicated at the state level. Finally, we're seeing growing policy and investment support for voluntary carbon markets. In March, the DOE launched the Voluntary Carbon Dioxide Removal Challenge to increase voluntary purchases of CDR credits and catalyze forward progress in this regard. And we saw a rapid industry response with pledges or agreements to purchase CDR credits from the likes of Google and Microsoft and AT&T. In Canada, a combination of mandates and policies is driving project development. Canada's federally mandated carbon price increased to $80 Canadian per ton in April of this year. and this will rise by $15 Canadian per ton annually moving forward, reaching $170 Canadian per ton by 2030, with all provincial programs required to meet this federal benchmark. In June, the federal government released an investment tax credit for CCUS projects, covering up to 50% of capital costs for projects, 60% for DAC, until the year 2030. Canada's Growth Fund, announced in November of last year, can allocate up to $7 billion Canadian for carbon contracts for difference to ensure a fixed minimum price of carbon. Canada now has 7 operating CCS facilities, 5 additional ones in construction, and a further 46 advancing through studies. If we look a little bit further south in Brazil, a CCS breakthrough occurred recently with the passage of the Fuels of the Future bill. This provides the foundation for CCS regulations in the country, making Brazil the first country in South America to develop such provisions. Additionally, Brazil continues successful CCS operations at its Santos Basin pre-salt reservoirs, with 13 million tons of CO2 injected last year. If we look at a different region across Asia, storage hubs and cross-border CCS projects are a major focus and dominant trend that we see. Cross-border projects incorporate CO2 capture in one country and storage in another. Nations with limited geologic storage resources, such as Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, are exploring opportunities with nations that have large storage resources, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, and Australia, to store their CO2. Governments across the region are laying the groundwork for CCS through new legislation, policies, and collaborative efforts. For early mover countries like Australia, the focus has been on strengthening existing regulations. There, the federal government passed a bill to allow the transboundary transport of CO2, and they've released a national action list for offshore CO2 storage to meet its obligations under the London Protocol. On a project front in Australia, it's notable that Santos's Moomba facility is in its final commissioning phase and is expected to announce commencement of operation before the end of this year. This will be Australia's second commercial CCS facility. Several other jurisdictions in the region passed their first CCS regulations, plans, or policies since our last global status report. Indonesia released a presidential regulation providing a framework for CCS regulation, and that regulation allows 30% of the project storage capacity to be used for imported CO2 from other nations. Japan released its CCS Business Act and is exploring 9 candidate CCS networks. Some networks would store CO2 in Japanese territories, while others are looking for storage elsewhere, such as in Malaysia. Malaysia is expected to release CCS legislation later this year and is explicitly seeking to establish itself as a storage hub for Asia, regarded as a long-term economic opportunity for the country. South Korea announced its CCUS Act, which will be fully enacted in February of 2025. The Act outlines processes around permitting, financial support mechanisms, and provides a framework for activities under operation, safety standards, and monitoring. Notably, all of the legislation released is considered of the transboundary movement of CO2. And again, we see that in many countries in the region. Simultaneously, collaboration is underpinning various aspects of public-private sectors are taking to establish transboundary projects. Many MOUs have been or are being signed between countries as a necessary first step to allow projects to proceed with pre-FEED type of work. Government-to-government agreements will be necessary as the next step to transporting CO2 across borders. Consortiums like the Shepherd CCS project, which is a public-private partnership between South Korean and Malaysian governments and a number of private sector companies, many based in South Korea. Consortiums are helping to connect the demand side to the storage hubs. This is a trend that we're witnessing in many regions, but specifically in developing Southeast Asia. And with all this activity in the Asia Pacific region, project development in the region is starting to gather momentum. Excluding China, which we'll discuss later, there's now 1 facility in operation, 4 currently in construction, and 52 being studied. In India, there's great potential for CCS with 4 interministerial CCUS task forces collectively working on various aspects of CCUS, including safety and technical standard development. And although there's a number of challenges that remain for the region across both regulatory and financing fronts, the amount of activity we've seen over this last year's reporting period is certainly encouraging to us at the Institute. This year, because of all of the activity, we've included a separate China section in our status report, which highlights the strong progress China is making in CCS. China's development of CCS remains strong and is demonstrated by climate policy progress, CCUS project deployment, and increased international collaboration. The National Development and Reform Commission, or NDRC, included CCUS in the implementation plan for green and low carbon technology demonstration program, a significant step, making the first time that CCS projects will be supported with funding from the central government. In April, the Commission announced 6 CCUS projects it would support both through grants and other forms of low-cost finance. Just a few months ago in July, China unveiled a plan to decarbonize its coal-fired power plants, aiming to reduce their emissions to match those of gas-fired plants by 2027, using strategies like co-firing with low-carbon ammonia and biomass, implementing CCUS, and again, supported by policy measures and financial backing. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of CCS development in China is on the large project front. Huaneng is on track to complete the world's largest coal power CCUS project with a capacity of 1.5 million ton per annum. In May, Xinjiang Oil Field, which is a subsidiary of China National Petroleum Corporation, began construction on a 2 million ton per annum coal-fired power plant CCUS project. And China Building Materials Group is now operating the world's largest oxy-fuel project in the cement sector with a capacity of 200,000 ton per annum. China also continues international collaboration on CCS. Late last year, the US and China committed to each advancing at least 5 large-scale cooperative CCUS projects by 2030, focusing on carbon capture from both industrial and energy sources. China and France also launched the China-France Carbon Neutrality Center, an initiative aimed at promoting research, technology transfer, and policy exchange related to carbon neutrality efforts between the two countries, an effort in which CCUS has received its due attention. So the APAC region broadly is seeing a notable scale up in CCS efforts, which is very, very welcoming. Now, to speak to us about the progress in Malaysia specifically is Malaysia's Minister of the Economy, His Excellency Rafizi Ramli, who has kindly recorded some remarks for us to share with you here today.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to congratulate the Global CCS Institute for the launching of the Global Status of CCS Report 2024 today. The Institute's continuous effort in providing insights and updates of the CCS deployment progress around the world through the publication of this report should be applauded. The global pursuit of a net zero future is not just contingent on trillions of investments going into climate mitigation projects. Much of the tension lies in there being sufficient regulatory support, but also a plausible economic argument for take-up. While it is a priority for many to decarbonize quickly, it must be done in a manner that can bring tangible impact and growth to our economy. The road to feasibly meeting net zero in 2050 requires the deployment of CCUS. It is difficult to think of a solution that can scale and meet the decarbonization demands of industries. However, rationalizing the sizable capital costs at this nascent stage often lies in regulatory support. Governments have to take a high vantage point in legislation for businesses to make the risk economics work for their corporate plannings. Hence, Malaysia's commitment to creating that framework. Malaysia will be tabling its standalone CCUS bill in Parliament in November this year. We are sprinting because we recognize our edge in being a regional CCS hub, not just for ASEAN, but the entire Asia-Pacific community. Malaysia is unique in not just having high-quality storage sites, but the corresponding quality in expertise to realize gains. We want to leverage this to provide an integrated CCUS solution for industries in Asia-Pacific, the first of its kind. Malaysia's vision of being a successful hub relies on greater regional cooperation. By harnessing the collective transportation infrastructure from every participating country, we can support faster deployment. This will reduce the per unit cost of CCUS deployment and facilitate uptake. As Malaysia takes the ASEAN chairmanship in 2025, CCUS will be a cornerstone example of our philosophy on economic integration, how the repurposing of dated oil sites can generate an entirely new industry, and how that industry can grow exponentially if we share our infrastructure and are in lockstep. I believe we are able to establish this rising industry. Malaysia and participating countries will pioneer a new economic paradigm, one that balances economic interests with a desire to achieve net zero. With that, I once again congratulate the Institute for today's report launching, and may this be another stepping stone to unlock CCUS possibilities. Thank you.
And I think Malaysia is just, one really good example of the progress we're seeing at the pace and scale in terms of accelerated progress toward deployment of CCS. The Institute is doing all we can to be supportive of our colleagues in Malaysia, both in the government and in the private sector. If we turn now to another region of the world, and look across Europe and the UK, the impact of European decarbonization policies is clearly evident. Europe now has 191 commercial scale CCS projects at various stages of development. 5 are operational and 10 projects are now in construction. CCS has gained considerable importance through climate and industrial policy agendas in Europe and specifically in the UK. The EU Industrial Carbon Management Strategy policy aligns with the European Commission's 2040 target and sets out a comprehensive policy approach to deliver against this target. The Net Zero Industry Act, NZIA, was introduced to drive investment infrastructure, and it mandates that EU oil and gas producers collectively invest in 50 million ton per annum of injection capacity by 2030, which is fast approaching. The UK Green Growth Accelerator is a £960 million fund for CCUS, greenhouse gas removals, and hydrogen. And the carbon removal certification framework remains pending, but its introduction could significantly enhance carbon dioxide removal initiatives. The Institute also applauds the very recent UK government announcement committing 21.7 billion GBP to advance carbon capture projects over the next 25 years. Commercial agreements for 5 projects have now been concluded with the government, making FID on these projects imminent. This support is a significant milestone for CCS scale-up in Europe. We've also seen many European countries, mainly EU member states, but also including the UK, Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland, making significant progress in enhancing their CCS policy and regulatory frameworks by adopting industrial carbon management strategies and roadmaps for CCS deployment. 9 countries, in addition to the EU, have introduced or announced industrial carbon management strategies or roadmaps, again, specific for CCS deployment. A good example is in the UK, which aims to establish CCS in 4 industrial clusters by 2030, capturing and storing 20 to 30 million ton per annum of CO2. Refining regulatory frameworks to enable or facilitate technology scaling, such as we've seen in Germany, Austria, France, or Italy, is also providing forward progress. And we've seen countries establishing agreements with other governments to foster bilateral cooperation in the sector. Industry-led initiatives also played a crucial role in promoting international collaboration. The surge in dedicated transport and storage project announcements in 2024, most of which have a cross-border dimension, is a very positive signal. This progress has been largely driven by EU policies, such as the European Commission's selection of 14 cross-border CO2 infrastructure projects on the list of projects of common interest and projects of mutual interest under the revised 10E regulation in Europe. On a project front, there have been several notable highlights, including transport and storage operations at Norway's Northern Lights are scheduled to begin before the end of 2024. Construction at the Porthos project in the Netherlands commenced in April of this year, and the number of dedicated CO2 transport and storage facilities in development in Europe reached 77, doubling in a year. For the region to meet its decarbonization and competitiveness objectives, more initiatives must reach financial investment decision or positive FID and move toward construction. But the progress that we're seeing this past year is remarkable and is to be applauded. If we look at another region, the Middle East and Africa region now has 3 projects in operation and another 6 in construction. In the MEA region, where CCS was initially driven by enhanced oil recovery as it provided economic incentive, we are seeing a shift to a focus on industrial decarbonization with low carbon fuel development, such as hydrogen, ammonia, or SAF, aligned with climate commitments. CCS policy development in the region is advancing quickly. The Middle East and Africa are rapidly integrating CCS into their decarbonization strategies, with countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia outlining ambitious targets. The UAE's industrial decarbonization roadmap and Saudi Aramco's increased CCS goal provide good examples of the region's commitment to leveraging CCS to achieve significant emission reductions, especially in hard-to-abate sectors. Carbon markets, too, are being established to support CCS deployment, which include initiatives like the UAE's Air Carbon Exchange and Saudi Arabia's carbon crediting scheme. Collaborations, just like we've seen in other jurisdictions, are at the fore of development in the Middle East and Africa region. And we're seeing this across the development of carbon markets, technology development, and various cross-border initiatives and projects. Technology and DAC products, companies like Saudi Aramco, ADNOC, and Oman's PDO are signing agreements to explore the development and adoption of new technologies. Notable projects include ADNOC's Habshan project, a 1.5 million ton per annum CCS network, and Oman's pilot DAC initiatives in the Hajar Mountains. There's cross-border projects. Countries in the Middle East region are establishing CCS hubs with projects like the Jubail Industrial Hub in Saudi Arabia, Sharjah's CCS hub, and Bahrain's cross-border CCS value chain, positioning the region as a future leader in CO2 sequestration and carbon trading, with a projected CCS capacity of 65 million ton per annum by 2035. If we look a little bit further south in Africa, there are several notable developments there as well, including Egypt progressing and identifying potential storage sites. In South Africa, a CCUS pilot well was drilled, marking a significant milestone for CCUS in that country. And in Kenya, a small-scale DAC project was launched. So yeah, I think overall, and we've just given you just a really short flavor here, you can see there's tremendous activity and an amount of CCS progress all around the globe. So in closing, I'd just like to draw out a few key points from the report and today's very brief presentation to you. Overall, if I take a step back, the outlook is positive for CCS globally. The 2024 Global Status Report highlights that the recognition of CCS as a critical decarbonization tool continues to translate into concrete action, with increased policy support, new investments, and project deployments worldwide. But challenges remain that must be overcome. Despite the significant progress that I just highlighted, headwinds remain. Difficult investment settings, community concerns, regulatory barriers continue to present headwinds to widespread deployment. And so from my perspective and from the Institute's, collaboration is key. CCS proponents must collaborate across sectors, across borders, and technologies to overcome these challenges, working together. We have just a quarter of a century until 2050, and the task at hand remains large. Governments, industry, the research community, the finance sector should continue to work together to remove barriers, lower costs, and really drive investment for this vital climate mitigation tool. So with that is some closing remarks on what I just presented. Thank you for your attention today. I'll now hand the discussion back over to Jess for more details and for a full link to the report. Jess, back over to you.
Thank you, Jared, so much for that quick but insightful overview. The growing CCS momentum we've had in the past 12 months is indeed very exciting to see. As I mentioned at the start, this is just an overview of the 2024 report, and you can download the full report from our website now. You can find it at globalccsinstitute.com/global status report, as you see in the link below, which will also pop up on your screen shortly. Or you can also use the QR code that we have off to the right of the screen here to download the full report. As I also mentioned, this session is being recorded and we'll share the recording on our website. So you're welcome to view that in the coming days. And lastly, please feel free to engage with us on social media and using the hashtag #GlobalStatus2024 to share your thoughts on the report, and we'll be sure to amplify that on our channels. Thank you again for being here. Goodbye.